I'm continuing to turn the attic into 2 livable rooms, and it was necessary to divide one large space into 2 with frame partitions. I didn't manage to do it correctly, and today I'll tell you why it turned out the way it did and how to do it right. Task number 1 is to build the frame for the future partitions, and the most important part is the layout. I used a laser level that projects multiple planes. This way I was able to make everything straighter, so the walls are parallel where they need to be and perpendicular where they should be. I marked center lines on the floor and immediately screwed the bottom track down for clarity. For the frame, I bought dry, planed, calibrated boards measuring 35 by 35 x 95. I had previously worked with metal profiles, but in this case I personally found it more convenient to work with boards, so I chose boards. I cut everything to size outside with a miter saw, and through bitumen on a manual gasket I screwed the boards to the floor with 75 mm self-tapping screws. Professionals likely noticed this is a major ongoing mistake, but let's review it step by step. In the meantime, I started discovering a whole new world of frame construction, since it turned out I didn't know much about it. But I see the goal and don't see any obstacles, and little by little the outline of the future partitions started to take shape. Right away, I found another mistake I made back at the design stage. It turned out I had planned for a corridor that was too narrow. I decided to widen it and add an extra corner by the stairs. This in turn led to the roof beam support post being in the wrong place, so I assembled an extra one from 2 nailed together boards. In the usual spots, the old board had to be removed. I did the same thing for the second partition, and for the posts in this spot, a double board was needed anyway, since this is the side where the doors will later be attached. The lower part of the partition frame ran as close as possible along the floor beams, while the upper part was supposed to follow the rafters. Before screwing the board to the rafters, I applied special self-adhesive sealing tape from bottom to top for insulation and to prevent air leaks where fasteners damaged the vapor barrier. Screwing in longer boards, especially overhead and alone, isn't convenient, so I sped up the job with a recent purchase, an oil-free compressor and pneumatic nailer. With their help, it was super convenient to temporarily fix the boards in place and move something if needed. I started the layout process with the door openings and using a laser level continued to place the studs in their positions, spacing them 60 centimeters on center. I did part of the partition a bit more correctly, assembling the top and bottom plates with the studs on the floor as a separate frame, and then lifting and installing it into its final position. Ideally, all partitions should be done this way. It's faster, more convenient, and higher quality, and with rectangular non-load-bearing partitions, that's exactly how I would do it. But because of the ridge beam support, the roof slope, and since I'm not a professional builder, personally, assembling it in place made more sense to me. Between all the studs, I screwed in crossbars at a height of 119 seam allers from the bottom plate, and after everything was in place, I thoroughly screwed it all together from all sides at once. Without brackets, I just screwed in the screws diagonally. I added 2 extra studs at each corner so there would be material to screw the finishing into from the other side. I didn't plan for all these spots, so in one inside corner I used wooden blocks to ensure there were enough boards. In these areas I had to cut part of the crossbar. Some of the boards on the crossbar got caught in the rain, and I saw firsthand how much the same board can differ when it's dry and when it's wet, and I removed a couple of resulting steps with an electric planer. Gluing the vapor barrier was also a very important part of the job. In the areas near the studs, it was necessary to seal the holes that had formed. If you put your hand up to them, you could feel the wind blowing right through. I thoroughly taped everything around the studs. I also fixed all the previous mistakes with the cheap tape, which just fell off after 2 years. The aluminum tape didn't come off anywhere, but in the end, it's also not the best option, since it tends to tear along the seam. I retaped all the defective spots in the vapor barrier. In my experience, I've tried a whole bunch of different tapes. Delta is the best tape, but it can cost you a fortune. And since they were already taping around the attic window with now protection, I saw firsthand that it's much cheaper overall and not much worse, so I bought more of it. The frame is ready so I can start covering it. For this I bought drywall. I also considered OSB, gypsum fiber board, and especially QuickDeck, which is laid on the floor. Sometimes you notice uneven seams, but you can sand them and apply wallpaper directly onto the QuickDeck. But I thought that when I want to change the wallpaper, and it's not if, but when, because that day always comes sooner or later. So, in that case, without putty, I would just curse myself later. Plus, because of the triangles with QuickDeck, there would be a lot of scraps since the tongue and groove wouldn't line up. Making the triangular partitions from drywall is nearly half the cost. Even with my workload, that's significant. Gypsum fiberboard works, but is pricier. OSB is a budget option, but it's also not very clear how to finish it afterward. That's why, in terms of finishing work, drywall was much clearer to me personally, so I chose it. I didn't try to save money, I even bought moisture-resistant drywall for standard rooms. Construction overall isn't cheap, and often my building material purchases amount to several 100,000 rubles. While saving for the next stage, I prefer my money to work for me, so I keep it in a savings account instead of leaving it on my card. Now is the best time for this as deposit interest rates have risen, but with so many banks, how can you quickly find the best terms? For example, you can use the Yandex search engine, which has a special section where you can choose a debit card, calculate a mortgage, or in my case, find the best bank to open a deposit. Just type open a deposit and set your preferred parameters, like amount and term. I prefer deposits that let you make partial withdrawals without losing interest. You can use it in the Yandex.Alice app through the link in the description. Use Yandex Search, it will really help you figure things out. And it's all because of that same staircase and working alone that I specifically bought small sheets of drywall, 0.6 by 1.5 meters big ones. Carrying them upstairs was impossible and I would have struggled working with them alone. I especially appreciated the convenience at the stairwell, where with each sheet I had to work in an increasingly awkward position. With large sheets, the whole process goes much faster, and it's better to buy them if possible, but as they say, circumstances dictate. While working, I realized closing the corridor would make it dark. The staircase lighting helps, but I still had to add another bulb, which I had planned for when wiring the first floor. For sheets that needed trimming, I measured them on site and used a level as a guide to score one side with a regular knife. I beveled the joint of 2 sheets using a special planer with replaceable blades from the same knife. I bent the sheet to break it along the scored line and cut the cardboard on the other side. I screwed the piece into place. While covering the walls, I nearly forgot to run the wire to the motion sensor for the staircase lighting. I used a rotary hammer to make a hole between the partition and the stringer, through which I managed to run the wire. Then, with a long drill bit, I made a hole in the future partition so I could hide the wire inside. And then carefully placed the motion sensor in the wall box. The wire is in place, so I can continue installing the drywall. It's standard to leave a gap from the floor. For this, I used a folded bitumen felt pad. Then I secured the sheet with a few screws and removed the pad. Some sheets needed to be trimmed, but only along one line, and using a knife didn't work well. In such cases, I also used a screw. Stable saws work, but a regular jigsaw would do the job too. On the staircase side, since I was careless, I didn't leave enough space between the wall and the stringer for 2 sheets of drywall, only for 1. That's why I beveled the edges at the joints and fastened the sheets about every 20 centimeters. Since there will be only 1 layer of sheets here, where there will be 2 layers of drywall, I didn't bevel the edge on the first one and fastened it about every 40 centimeters. Also, you're supposed to stagger the joints, but I missed that on the first layer. I'll demonstrate this on the second layer. For fastening, I bought supposedly special drywall screws. Wood screws are supposed to have a different thread, but these looked like regular black screws. You have to screw them in straight and carefully. A special bit with a magnetic attachment helps with this, acting as a depth stop. It's important for the screw head to be sunk in evenly. If it sticks out too much, it will make the finishing work more difficult. And secondly, it's very important not to tear the paper. After all, the gypsum itself doesn't hold the fastener at all. Everything is actually held by the paper facing, and a screw that's screwed in crookedly tears it apart. After just a couple of screws, I regretted immediately buying a pack of 4,000 pieces. Almost every third one turned out to have this kind of head defect. Because of it, the drywall would tear and I either had to screw in another fastener or throw this one away. That wasted more screws and more time. And as paradoxical as it may sound, it will actually be cheaper if you buy screws that cost more. I should have bought 100 pieces from various manufacturers, compared them, and then ordered the main batch. I also didn't realize at first that I was using my favorite impact driver again, which can drive a screw right through the whole stud, even with an expansion bit. I tried using a screwdriver with torque adjustment, but it didn't work out. The problem is the inconsistency of the wood. In one spot it goes in like butter and needs one level of force. But right next to a knot, the wood is much denser and you need a completely different amount of force. It would probably work with a metal profile. In that case, you should really consider a collated screw gun, even for a small amount of work. Mine probably would have paid for itself by making the work faster. But past Ilya didn't see this video, so he kept using the impact driver by feel. It's also very important to keep a distance from the edge, because the gypsum just crumbles and breaks, and in that case the sheet doesn't get fixed properly. That's when I realized my mistake in choosing the studs. I should have gotten them at least 45 mm thick, not 35 mm, so that at the joint of two drywall sheets there would be enough space to screw in both screws with a proper distance from the edge of the sheet. And this was especially noticeable in the corners on the second layer, where it was rarely possible to screw into the stud because it was shifted another 12 mm to the side. When I finished installing the first layer of drywall on the partitions, I added some more wiring for outlets and switches. I laid some of the wiring and corrugated conduit between the floor beams even before the rough flooring work, but for some reason I didn't finish it back then and only now remembered about the switches. The switches made me think. Since on the first floor of my house, part of the lighting is controlled by a smart home system, and in practice I used wireless smart switches. So, in theory, I could have avoided laying any additional wires at all. The power is already supplied to the light bulb, and then you can simply attach a wireless switch directly onto the finished wall. That's how I have it set up in my kitchen, for example. You could turn on the light with a button or by telling Elisa, "Turn on the bed." It's not always a necessity everywhere, but sometimes I really enjoy it. If I had to buy extra wiring, I might have gone with wireless switches. But since I still had some wiring left over from the work on the first floor, I decided to lay it anyway, since it definitely wouldn't make things worse. Back then, I bought VVG NG 3x2.5 cable for the outlets and two 2x1.5 cables for the lighting. I used a spade bit to drill through all the studs in the middle closer to the bottom and pulled the necessary amount of wire through. Before making the hole for the outlet box, I started attaching the second layer of drywall at that spot. This time I placed it horizontally to offset the seams and still put it on a spacer. The first few times I used a laser level so it would show the lines where the stud runs. Since the fasteners are already hidden behind the sheet, I wanted to make sure I didn't miss. But after a couple of sheets, I got the hang of it and could do it by eye without missing. I also tried not to forget to bevel the edges at the joints of the sheets. I appreciated the planer. It makes the job much faster and cleaner than just cutting with a knife. That way the joints will be easier to finish later. The sheets near the opening were bent. To speed up the work, I didn't mark it in advance. I just installed the whole piece. It was easier to cut it on site, using the stud as a guide. And I started the next row with the whole sheet in the opposite direction to keep the joints staggered. There was room for the outlet box, and since the first floor switch height was set for me, I matched it on the second floor. I had a 70mm concrete hole saw left over from previous work, so I quickly made the necessary hole and ran the wire through it. I also made a hole for the motion sensor by the stairs. First, I reinforced it from the back with a second layer, which ended up being unnecessary since I could barely fit the insulation later. It really didn't want to compress into the extra holes, not even 12mm. If it had been the same insulation I used for the floor, it would have compressed without any problem. But for the partitions, I bought denser, more expensive acoustic mineral wool. Apparently, its fiber structure is different, but the density also has a direct effect here. Greater density improves sound insulation. The spacing of the studs and crossbars was chosen specifically not only so that the sheet material could be screwed in, but also to minimize cutting the mineral wool and to make sure it fits tightly without gaps. That's exactly why the board is 35 by 95 and not exactly 100, so the wool is pressed in as tightly as possible. Also, it's 95 mm and not exactly 100, so it fits as tightly as possible. It's important not to make the same mistake I did with the flooring. That time I bought compressed packs, meaning the wool was in a compressed state. They're convenient to transport and easy to carry. But I didn't know that the wool never expands back to its stated size. It's still okay for flooring, but for walls you definitely shouldn't use compressed packs. Check this at the store before ordering, since before they just delivered whatever without telling me. It's also important to note that with some manufacturers the wool is 1.2 meters long, while with others it's just 1 meter. That's why you need to know in advance what you'll be filling it with, so you don't make a mistake with where to place the blocking. On the sloped parts there was no way to do it without trimming the wool. And for that the level still helped as a guide, and I cut the wool with an insulation knife. At the beginning of the construction I barely managed to convince myself to buy it, but now I'm really glad I did. The boards from the pack hardly produce any dust, but when you start cutting them, that's when the real fun with etching begins. It's not as bad as fiberglass, but it's still not pleasant. I had to use a respirator, and honestly I should have worn something with long sleeves because afterwards my forearms were irritated, and goggles too since my eyes were itching. That's why I don't like frame construction, because of working with mineral wool. I opened the windows to try to get rid of the dust, but it didn't help much. I taped some frame gaps beforehand so wool wouldn't stick out and spent a while thinking about the film. For exterior walls, an interior vapor barrier is essential. It acts as a vapor barrier and prevents the wool from absorbing moisture. Airtightness is also an important factor, both in terms of heat loss and sound insulation. But for interior partitions, whether you need a vapor barrier depends on the situation and the purpose of the structure. Since I'm separating two rooms that are expected to have the same temperature, here's an explanation in construction terms why a vapor barrier isn't necessary between them. Moreover, from past experience, it turned out that the subsequent layer of polymer putty, glue, and non-woven wallpaper will fully serve as additional protection in case any insulation fibers do end up making their way out. If you want to play it safe and use a vapor barrier membrane, this is one of the best options. On the second layer of drywall, I tried to cover the doorways a bit more properly. Ideally, this should be done from a single large sheet, and the opening should be cut out on the installed sheet so there are no seams at the edges, since that's where cracks are most likely to appear. And here too, the advantage would be with larger sheets. When building the house, I tried to achieve acoustic comfort, meaning good sound insulation both from outside the house and between the rooms inside. For this, I specifically made the partitions on the first floor thicker, created a good layered structure for the floors, and separated each room from the others with 2 doors. I had the most concerns because of the frame partition. Earlier in life, I built a frame partition at my parents' house using bars and brackets, filling it with the same insulation I'd used in the floors. And at first everything was great. At most you could hear a muffled sound from the next room if someone was talking behind the wall. But after a year and a half, you could clearly hear every word, meaning the soundproofing was gone. The insulation had evaporated. I think in that case, first, the wooden bars dried out and large gaps appeared at the joints, and second, the loose insulation settled a lot under the merciless force of gravity. This time I tried to take those things into account. Plus, there are myths going around the internet that insulation supposedly doesn't really block much sound anyway. When I was working on the ventilation system, I tested this myth in practice. I simply took the insulation boards from the pack and surrounded the exhaust fan with them, and I saw firsthand that insulation really does help with soundproofing. It makes a big difference. I filled the partition frames in the attic while music was playing on the first floor, and with each filled section, the music became less and less audible. Unfortunately, I don't have a sound level meter, but by ear, the soundproofing of the 145 mm thick frame partitions in the attic turned out to be completely comparable to partitions made of 150 mm thick D500 aerated concrete blocks with 1 cm of plaster on both sides. The soundproofing isn't perfect, and some kind of brick or concrete would give a better result, but for everyday life and daily activities, it turned out to be quite comfortable. Also, from my experience living on the first floor, I realized that you should forget about single outlets and always plan for at least double ones everywhere. So using a laser, I marked the spot for a second outlet and used a hole saw to drill additional holes. I also got a special chamfering tool for a better quality installation of the outlet boxes. And honestly, the work on the roof and these 2 partitions was enough for me to decide that I don't want to do this kind of thing in my life anymore. Pouring concrete, laying aerated blocks, and plastering are much more straightforward to me, and honestly, they require much less skill to build a good house. A good frame house is truly a work of art with an incredible number of details, and when you're doing this kind of work for the first time in your life with your own hands, you really have to put in a lot of effort to achieve a decent result. Even after building the house and watching a lot of masterclasses, what I ended up with still looks like some kind of amateur hour job. These are just interior partitions, and they'll work well enough. Upon reaching the second floor, you enter a spacious vestibule with entrances to rooms on both the left and right. Both rooms ended up being 16 square meters in size, and that's not counting the area of the storage niches. Decorative partitions will appear under the beams, separating the storage area from the main room space. I also plan to cover the gables with drywall. From the floor to the ridge, it's 2.5 meters, and since the room is intended for children, that's more than enough even considering the slope. I conducted a survey regarding the future finishing work, considering that my first floor is done the way we're used to seeing in nice apartments. And on the second floor, there was an idea to make it look more like a country house, and the votes were split exactly 50-50. I have a reference for the final result, and you can create this kind of beauty yourself for a reasonable price. And I decided that I would make all the vertical surfaces with drywall, putty plaster, and putty again, and all the sloped surfaces I would make with imitation timber. This room turned out really spacious, bright, and cool. Here, thanks to this corner, now you can make a desk from wall to wall, and there will be a kind of workspace, for example, for a child. And it really turned out to be a nice room. The most interesting part of the finishing work was this, but how to make it all look clean and finished later, I honestly can't imagine yet. Because there's still an uncovered piece of insulation sticking out there since I'm not tall enough to screw the sheet in place. And I need to come up with some kind of setup for how to work at that height, on a ladder. And the second room, let's call things by their names, turned out to be flawed. And here I plan to cover up this niche to completely block access to the panel. I'll leave some kind of hatch, latch, or something like that, and so the kitchen exhaust won't be heard all the way through. And this room was intended to be my office. In this area, it was supposed to be my workspace, and this little extension here, which I decided not to cover up, can be used to store some stuff, plus you can put a bed in this niche. And for regular sleeping, of course, that would be totally ridiculous, but let's say it could be used as a guest option, where sometimes you need to put someone up, you could even fit 2 people, and that would actually be really helpful. My biggest mistake was with the placement of the windows. This is one of those cases where building without a plan leads to certain consequences, like a first-time experience, making rookie mistakes and all that. The design for my house actually came after the construction was done, and in it everything is drawn up properly. All the information is in the pinned comment for anyone who's interested. It turned out that there were supposed to be 4 attic windows, not 2. And the third window was supposed to go right here above the stairs, and it fits well here, so it can be added. And the fourth window was supposed to be right here in this exact area. And the thing is, because of the beams, it has to be shifted a bit higher, just like that one. And it ends up right in the middle of the window, right above this partition, so you can't put a window here. And, as I mentioned in the video about installing skylight windows, if I were to build again, I would avoid using these beams. In the places where the windows are installed, I would use double rafters so that the windows could be set a bit lower. And that way, it would fit nicely here in the niche. Everything would be symmetrical, cool, and beautiful. In my case, since it turned out the way it did, I either have to leave the room without windows or sacrifice symmetry and shift them a bit to this side. Since my professional activity involves video and audio production, windows in my office would actually only get in the way, so that's why I ordered not 4 skylights at once, but 2. Because later, someday, maybe one day, I might add them there. Overall, 2 would have been enough for me, and in my office they were kind of, well, I didn't really need them at all, so it turned out the way it did. Even without windows, I think it's quite possible to find a purpose for 16 square meters and the space won't go to waste. I read all your comments about this house being up for sale now. There were a lot of emotions. And I'll tell you about that another time. Today though, it's all about construction. I almost forgot to mention another mistake. This corner was done incorrectly because this drywall sheet should have been shorter and this one longer so that it would overlap the other. Because later we'll install a corner bead and the corner bead doesn't cover both sheets. To prevent any cracks from appearing here and to finish everything properly, it should have been done the way I did it on the other corners, so that only one sheet has a joint here. Because those are done with an offset, and even with 2 layers, each sheet overlaps. This way it turns out better and the finish is of higher quality. I also noticed how much better the finish turns out when you do it in 2 layers. It's not forbidden to do it in 1 layer, even the manufacturer has clear instructions laid out for how to do it in 1 layer. But in 2 layers, it's much better even in terms of resistance to vandalism. It's damn near impossible to break it when it's done in 2 layers. In 1 layer it breaks very easily. I've already bought most of the materials to continue the work, and now I just need to fully recover. So subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out, and see you in the next video.